p.m. in the fellowship hall, crafts, games, and foods will be provided. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. Turn your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 15. 2 Samuel chapter 15. Our story today is a story of, I guess, partially the consequences of things we do wrong in life. It's also a story of betrayal, multiple betrayals. It's the story, of course, of an estranged son and a father and the problems between a son and a father. And it's also overarchingly the story of how God keeps his promises. So we're going to begin in 2 Samuel chapter 15. You remember that David and his son Absalom had been estranged from one another for about 5 years. And finally, after 5 years, David allowed Absalom back into his presence and kissed Absalom. However, Absalom still was filled with a lot of resentment and a lot of things in his heart. And the Bible says that Absalom was everybody's buddy. For example, if you go to 2 Samuel 15, verse 2, he would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate, and whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." And Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there's no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that he gets justice." And then also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out and take his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. "You know, you're my buddy." And Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites. This is called politicking. This is called manipulation. He was everybody's good old boy. He was everybody's good old buddy, you know. And it definitely had an effect, because it says in verse 6, Absalom behaved this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. He was a manipulator of the finest order, and it worked. Now, how long did it take? Look at verse 7. At the end of 4 years. So this was 4 years of glad handing. 4 years of back behind the door deals with people to make their situation right. 4 years of learning names and gaining political clout. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living at Geshur in Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron." So the king said, "Go in peace." So he's tricking David. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, 'Absalom is king in Israel.'" So he sneaks out of Jerusalem under false pretenses. He goes to Hebron, and all the people he's been glad-handing are now in his camp, and he proclaims himself king in Hebron. Now, one of the things that happens here, and we're going to come back to this, is one of his friends on the inside was David's counselor, but we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. So David realized when this happened that things were getting bad, and that he was going to be run out of Jerusalem, because he realized what a great following that Absalom had. If you look at verse 15 in 2 Samuel 15, a messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." So David said, "We got to get out of town. We've got to get out of Jerusalem, because he's going to be coming for us." So David took all of his house. If you look at verse 16, he set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So we already know that David had multiple wives, and now he also has at least 10 concubines that he leaves behind, and he starts going out of the city. Notice down at verse 23, the whole countryside wept aloud as the king passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley. You know, you go out of the gates of Jerusalem, and you go down into the Kidron Valley, and you go up over the Mount of Olives, and then out toward the Judean desert. So the king crossed the Kidron Valley, and the people moved on toward the desert. So while he's leaving town, and a bunch of his men are leaving with him, because Absalom has rounded up a big group of men against him, he looks around and he sees the high priest Zadok and the Ark of the Covenant, and they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant out of Jerusalem to follow King David. But there's a problem with that. See, God said that the people were to go to the place which the Lord your God shall choose to put his name there. And God chose Jerusalem, and God chose the Temple of Solomon, and God said, my altar and my worship is to be there. But what if the king has to leave Jerusalem? Does that change what God said about worship and the Ark of the Covenant and all that? Well, no. So kudos to David here. If you look at verse 25 in this passage, the king said to Zadok, take the Ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it in his dwelling place again. But if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. Now, this tells me a couple of things. Number one, it tells me that David knew that in a lot of ways God was not pleased with him. David had done a bunch of things that he knew were wrong, and he thought maybe these were some of the consequences of those things. But the second thing is he knew for sure that God wanted the Ark of the Covenant and his place of worship in Jerusalem. And he calls it, if you look at verse 25, he calls it his dwelling place. See, that was God's dwelling place. So David was not about to mess with that, and so he sent Zadok and his people back into the city with the Ark of the Covenant. Verse 29 says, so Zadok and Abiathar the priest took the Ark of God back to Jerusalem, and they stayed there. So there's this rebellion afoot. Absalom's going to take over the city. That doesn't change anything about the high priest and the Ark of the Covenant and the worship of God. So David is going up the Mount of Olives, and we're going to come back to some things that happened in the in-between. But as he leaves the city of Jerusalem and he's going out of the city, if you go over to chapter 16, there's this guy by the name of Shimei, and he sees which way the wind is blowing. Some people go like this, and they try to see which way the wind is blowing before they decide what to do. See? It's not about really right or wrong with them. It's like, which way's the wind blowing? So this is what Shimei was like, and we'll find him later turning around completely. But verse 5 of chapter 16 says, as King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there, and his name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. And he pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and special guard were on David's right and left. This guy had some gall, didn't he? So he's throwing rocks at the king. Me and my buddy, when we were in the 4th grade, we liked to throw rocks at each other. Yeah, that's dumb, wasn't it? And we would stand, 50 yards off or 25 yards off and throw rocks with each other, and it was fun until I hit him square in the head with one, and it caused blood and everything, and we thought maybe we better quit doing that stuff. But there was this case where this guy, a grown man, is hurling rocks at the king and all of his people and cussing him as he goes out. Verse 7, as he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you man of blood, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has handed the kingdom over to your son, Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a man of blood. Well, David's thinking there might be some truth in what this guy says. So, of course, the people that were around David, his bodyguard, verse 10, the king, well, let's back up to verse 9. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over there and cut off his head. And the king said, what do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? See, David is thinking, I deserve everything that's happening to me. I've done things I shouldn't have done. The Lord was displeased on me, and now it's probably coming back on me. And he might have been right to a certain degree. Maybe the Lord was letting some of this happen to him to get his mind right. Then David said to Abishai, who's one of these sons of Zeruiah, and all his officials, my son, who is my own flesh, is trying to take my life. How much more than this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing that I am receiving today. So, again, David thinks, I think I probably deserve everything I'm getting, and if this is what the Lord is doing to me, then I need to take my punishment and go on. And if he wants me to be back in Jerusalem, then I'll be back in Jerusalem. Interesting way of thinking about things, huh? So David and his men went on the road, while Shimei went along the hillside opposite him and cursed as he went and threw stones at him and flung dust. That must have gotten old after a while, you think? And that guy kept pelting him with rocks. And so finally he said the king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan, and there he refreshed himself. Now, backing up just a little bit, during this same time, there was a man that was David's close confidant in the palace, and his name was Ahithophel. Ahithophel was a wise man. He was an advisor, and he gave David advice, and everybody in Judah thought that if Ahithophel, it's hard to say, if Ahithophel said it, it must be right, and we better take his advice, because they all looked up to him as a wise man. But if you'll go back to chapter 15 and verse 30, and this is part of his exit from the city of Jerusalem. David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot, and all the people with him covered their heads too, and they were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Talk about a stab in the back. The guy that had been his right-hand man, that had been giving him advice all these years, and he'd been taking the advice. Now the closest advisor that David had, that everybody respected, he's taking sides with Absalom instead of David. How bad do you think that one hurt? That one hurt really bad, didn't it? And so David prayed at that point. He said, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." Now there was this guy that was traveling alongside David, and his name was Hushai, the Archite. And Hushai was a friend of David's, and he was about to go out of town with David. And David said, "No, I want you to go back into town, and I want you to greet Absalom." If you drop down to verse 34, "But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I will be your servant, O king. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I'll be your servant,' then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice." So drop down to verse 37. So David's friend Hushai arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. See, so as David is escaping to the east, Absalom is now coming into the city to take the city of Jerusalem. So that sets us up for betrayal number 2. So as David is leaving the city, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, Saul's son, comes out. Remember, Mephibosheth was the crippled son of Saul. And I don't know if you remember, but David had asked, is there any of Saul's relatives left so that I can be kind to them? And so they said, yes, there's this one young man who is a cripple. He's Saul's crippled son, and he's still alive. And so David went and found his servant, Saul's servant Ziba, and told him that all of Saul's possessions would go to Mephibosheth, and that Ziba would be the caretaker of all of his land and cattle and all that kind of stuff. So as David's leaving town, this guy Ziba, who was Mephibosheth's caretaker, he comes out with the donkey saddled. If you look at verse 1 of chapter 16, he has all kinds of loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine, food and supplies for David. And he says, why have you brought these? And Ziba answered in verse 2, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and fruit are for the men to eat. Drop down to verse 3. The king then asked, where is your master's grandson? That's the crippled young man. Ziba said to him, he is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom. So Mephibosheth, that he was so kind to and that he provided for and that he said he'll always eat at my table, he stabs David in the back too. Now, do you start to get the picture of how bad this was? His closest counselor stabs him in the back. Mephibosheth, that he was so kind to, stabs him in the back, betrays him. Being betrayed is a hard thing, isn't it? It really hurts. And this hurt David badly. And it was after these things had already taken place that the guy comes out and he starts throwing the rocks and cursing David. And David says, well, maybe I am cursed by the Lord, and maybe I'm getting my comeuppance for all the things that I've done that were not right. All right, so in the process of him leaving, go down to chapter 16 and verse 15. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Then Hushai the Archite, see, that's David's friend that he sent back into town to keep watch for him. Hushai the Archite, David's friend, went to Absalom and said to him, long live the king, long live the king. And Absalom asked Hushai, is this the love you show your friend? Why didn't you go with your friend? And Hushai said to Absalom, no, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel, his will I be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son just as I serve the father? And Absalom, verse 20, said to Ahithophel, give us your advice. What should we do? Well, remember, Ahithophel was the wisest man around, and everybody took his advice. So Ahithophel said, okay, here's what you need to do, Absalom. Have him build a tent on the roof of the palace. And in the sight of all the people, you take all 10 of his concubines in there, and you go to bed with all 10 of his concubines, showing that you are now the king. Now, this is pretty terrible, but in that day and time, in those ancient cultures, when a king was conquered, the other king that conquered the king took his harem. And that was the way this thing worked in ancient culture. Now, it's not a right thing to do. It wasn't a good thing to do, but it's what he did. And so, at the advice of Ahithophel, this is what he did. And so, it says, verse 22, they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now, in those days, The advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. So now the turncoat, Ahithophel, is giving Absalom advice about how to solidify his takeover of the kingdom so that all the people of Israel can see, yes, he has claimed the throne, he has taken over the household, Absalom is king in Jerusalem. Now this is a sad story right here, isn't it? It's a sad story because King David, who for so long was a man after God's own heart, he's getting beat up in the worst sort of a way, and he's disgraced in the worst sort of a way. Ahithophel turns against him. Mephibosheth turns against him. Shimei wants him dead and cusses him and throws stones on him all the way out of town. And that's not the seriousness of it, because, see, the underlying story here is that as David was fleeing from Jerusalem, he knew that Absalom and his troops would be coming after David, because he knew that he was actually fleeing for his life. So David was busy trying to save his life with the few people that were with him at the time, and Absalom was busy taking over the kingdom. But now, God had made David some promises earlier. Go back to 2 Samuel 7, verse 12 and 13. God had made David promises about his kingdom and about his successor, and how that his successor would build a house for his name. And even though all this bad stuff is happening to David, maybe, partly, to show David the consequences of how he treated Absalom. I mean, let's rewind the story. Did he ever do justice for Tamar, who was raped? Not that we know of. Didn't he reject Absalom because Absalom actually killed the guy that raped his sister? Right? Didn't he banish Absalom and didn't want to see his face for 3 years? And then when he finally let him back into Jerusalem, he said, you can come to Jerusalem, but I don't want to look at your ugly face. And it was only after 5 years that he let Absalom back in. And then did he expect everything to just be hunky-dory after all that had gone on under the bridge? See, we're talking about the consequences of our actions. Now let's separate two things here. Let's separate the fact that God can forgive our actions when we repent. Separate that on one shelf over here. But that doesn't change the fact that when we do things in this world, with people in this world, that sometimes there are consequences that we still have to face for the actions that we've done in this world. So David is kind of in the midst of this story doing a lot of things. So at the end of chapter 16, David is fleeing, While David flees from Absalom, Hushai's counsel gives him time to escape across the Jordan. Now, I'm going to show you this map. So Jerusalem's up in the mountains, see? And as you go to the east toward Gilgal, you're going down through the mountains, and you're going to get to the mountains are going to come out, and you're going to get to a desert plain. And that desert plain is going to lead out to the Jordan River. And then on the other side of the Jordan River, you're going to get into the country of Moab back in that time, and Ammon, and you're going to go across the river there. This is what David's journey was. He gets across to a place called Mahanaim on the other side of the Jordan, outside of what we would consider to be Israel today, okay? On the other side of the river. So David's fleeing for his life, trying to go that way. So back at chapter 17, verse 1, Ahithophel, who is his turncoat counselor, says to Absalom, I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror. Then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king, and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all, and all the people will be unharmed. This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. And in fact, it's what he should have done. But Absalom said, summon Hushai the Archite. See, this was David's spy that he sent back in, so we can hear what he has to say. And when Hushai came to him, Absalom said, Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. And Hushai replied to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel has given you is not good this time. You know your father and his men, they are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, there has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom. Even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear, for all Israel knows that your father is a fighter and that those with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, that's from north to south, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you. Gather your army first. Then we will attack him, wherever he may be found. So Absalom, who was not a general and was not a fighter like his father, decided to take this advice because that sounded like the right thing. Verse 14, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the advice of Hushai the Archite is better than the advice of Ahithophel, for the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Now put a little bracket around that verse. For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. See, the Lord is working in this. The Lord is going to keep his promise to David, even though David is going through these things. All right, so then, this is an involved story. And if y'all, some of the details really get weird, but David sends out these two guys that are going to take the message to David about that it's time now to cross the Jordan and get out of the country while you can with your life. So these two guys go out, and Absalom's men come out, and they're about to catch him, and they go down this well, and they hide in a well, and this lady puts a canvas over the well or something and puts grain on top of it, and these two messengers of David are down in the well, and when Absalom's men leave, they come up out of the well, and they finally go and they find David, and they came to David and they went to inform him. So go down to 17:21, chapter 17, verse 21. After the men had gone, the two climbed out of the well and went to inform David. They said to him, set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you. So David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. Now, see on this map, that little red line from Jerusalem to Gilgal to the Jordan doesn't look very far. But if you're actually, and it's not, as the crow flies, it's not that far. But if you're going through those mountains and all those ravines and up and down mountains, and it's quite a journey down through those mountains. Now they've got highways and buses and stuff like that. Back then, they didn't, And it's quite a journey down through those mountains and then out across that desert to the Jordan and then over across the Jordan. So David gets west or east of the Jordan into safety. Now, verse 23 is a big one that you ought to look at too. When Ahithophel, see, this is back in Jerusalem, and he realizes that Absalom has taken another guy's advice and given David more time. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, see, this was a new thing for him. Because every time he spoke, everybody took his advice because they knew he was wise and he was the wisest man around. He's the one that turned against David, see? So he saw that his advice had not been followed. He saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order, and then he hung himself. And so he died and was buried in his father's tomb. The betrayer got kind of demoted. His pride, he thought everybody listened to him, and now somebody's not listening to him, so he gets depressed and kills himself. I guess he figures David's going to win out if it doesn't go the way he advised them to do, so he kills himself. And David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. So now see, Absalom's chasing him, and you see up there, right next to the word Absalom, you see Mahanaim. In the book of Genesis, Jacob is there before he crosses the Jordan back into Egypt, and some angels meet him at Mahanaim. And he called the place two camps, because there was the camp of the angels and there was the camp of Jacob. This is the same place you read about in the book of Genesis, if anybody cares, which they probably don't. Okay. So, all right. We already talked about all that. He hung himself. Who else hung himself later in the Bible? Judas did, didn't he? So now we have, in chapter 18, the great battle that ensues between David and his men and Absalom and his men. Now see, on the other side of the Jordan, up there at Mahanaim, is a place of forests. You come up out of the desert and you go into the mountains over on the other side, and there's forests up in that area. And so this battle between Absalom's men and David's men, it takes place up in the forest. Look at 18:1. David mustered the men who were with him. A lot of people had come toward David, and appointed them and commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. David sent the troops out, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai the Gittite. And the king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. But the men said, you must not go out. If we are forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. But you are worth 10,000 of us. It would be better now for you to give us support from the city. So the king agreed. Verse 5, the king commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. He said, please be gentle for my sake with the young man Absalom. Now, wait a minute, David. Wait a minute. You see how messed up this is? It's not messed up from the fact that he loves his son, but he banished his son basically for 5 years. And then it took 4 years for his son to manipulate everybody and take his kingdom. And then all these people have come out with him, and all these men are going to die in this battle. But yet the leader of this rebellion that's heard everything, he says, please be gentle with the young man, my son. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to the commanders about Absalom. So verse 6, the army marched into the field to fight Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. There the army of Israel was defeated by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men. Can you imagine 20,000 men in one day being killed in the battle? The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest claimed more lives that day than the sword. So Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in the tree, and he was left hanging in midair while the mule he was riding on kept going. And when one of the men saw this, he told Joab, I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. Verse 11, Joab said to the man who had told him this, what? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I would have given to you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt. But the man replied, even if 1,000 shekels were weighed into my hands, I would not lift my hand against the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, protect the young man Absalom for my sake. If I had put my life in jeopardy and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me. So Joab said, I am not going to wait like this for you. So Joab took 3 javelins and in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom, struck him, and killed him. So they chopped him up bad and left him hanging in that tree. But then they took him down, it says, verse 16. Joab sounded the trumpet then and stopped the battle. The troops stopped pursuing Israel, for Joab halted them. They took Absalom and threw him into a big pit in the forest and piled up a large heap of rocks over him. And meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. Now, back up to this map. See, David was king in Judah in the south. All of Israel had been under David's kingship, but it was the northern tribes, a lot of the northern tribes that followed the leadership of Absalom and rebelled against the kingdom, see? So when it talks about the Israelites, it's talking about all those northern people that were on the side of Absalom in this battle. That's what he's talking about. So, Absalom got killed. And then they're going to tell David. Now, who's going to tell this to David? And is that going to be good for the guy that tells David? We're not thinking so, huh? So David's waiting for the news of the battle, and 2 guys go running to give this news. One of them is Ahimaaz, and the other is this Cushite guy. The first guy comes, and David says, well, what's the news from the battle? And the first guy says, well, I don't know. It was confusing out there where Absalom was, so I don't really know what happens. And this other guy's comes, and he says, your son Absalom's been killed today. Look at verse 31. This is 18:31. Then the Cushite arrived and said, my lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has delivered you today from all who rose up against you. And the king asked the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? And the Cushite replied, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man. And the king was shaken. And he went to the room over the gateway and he wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. So David wins, but he loses too, doesn't he? Can you imagine the grief? Can you imagine the sadness? Can you imagine the devastation? Everything was torn up, wasn't it? Well, next time we're going to see how that comes out the other side. Okay?